naval forces began landing Allied armies on the northern coast of France.
An automotive age, traveling on time-saving superhighways.
You are go for EVA.
Made more productive with powerful new microcomputers, small enough to fit on every desk.
This is actually the very first Chrysler. We think about cars today, everyone calls an automobile, they call it a car. The term car is just a shortened version of motor carriage. They just took the horse away and replaced it with a motor. So that's why this car is proportioned the way it is, right? It almost looks like a carriage, and then you could have easily chopped off the hood and put a horse there and it would have been perfect. So this car on the radiator cap has two wings up there. That theme of the Chrysler wings carries on to today. We've completely modernized it to have a fresh, clean appearance, but it goes all the way back to the very first one. So if you look inside this car, you get almost like a carriage feeling from the seating, but then if you look at the instrument panel in front of the steering wheel, it's one clean flat surface. Certainly even by today's standards, it feels very modern. We always offer a little bit more, if it's a little more style, a little more pride in ownership, that people, when they see the car, when they drive the car, it's something that they can experience, and that goes all the way back to the first one. Art Deco was a movement that really picked up in the US in the 30s. It was a non-traditional elegance that kind of signified wealth and sophistication, and this car really does that in a big way. It all feels integrated. The way the front end of the car flows into the hood, flows into the top of the cars, the way the fenders are integrated, the body actually starts to flare out a little bit to accept the fenders, which is something on modern day cars we completely take for granted. And this was one of the few cars that was developed in the wind tunnel, so it's sleeker, it's more efficient, quieter, faster than other cars of the era. But the main thing in that car that it's an inspiration down to what we do today are the two large dials. If you look at the 300, the 200, all of our cars basically, that's really inspired from the airflow. This car was very, very groundbreaking and really started the inspiration of what we know as today's modern car. It was one of the first new cars that was post-war. The US economy was on the rise, and that was a time when it was okay to show decadence. It was the apple of many of Hollywood personalities' eyes. The most significant thing is the wood paneling on the side of the car. Well, if you look at the way the fender washes out into the body side, imagine crafting that out of a piece of wood, right? A line that fades out with a beautiful section going through it, and then having that right next to the sheet metal. To me, that speaks to precision, it speaks to craftsmanship, and it's the beautiful execution of all of the pieces that really stands out. Back then, cars were very formed, very round. You looked at reflections as almost the lines that described what the car was doing, and today we use actual feature lines. As designers, we create things for others to enjoy, and you can imagine the guys that hand-built these back then were feeling the same thing.
It was really the first muscle car. There was a 300 horsepower engine, Hemi engine, underneath the hood of this thing, and it was actually the fastest production car available at the time. The country coming out of the war, the whole idea of suburbia kind of sprouted up during that time. There was this desire then to showcase something different. They were looking for something a little more unique. It used to be referred to as the beautiful brute. When you think about it, it's like having a linebacker in a tuxedo or something. It was just a real simplistic kind of vehicle. The body itself is very simple, very sculptural, very clean. It's a very powerful looking front end, a little trim on the body, and just a very simplistic rear end. And the thing went like hell. It was the beginning of styling as we know it for the Chrysler brand. This is really the first evidence of that. You're always trying to tap in and trying to figure out what can I do that's a little different than what the guy down the street is doing or what the guy on the other side of the world is doing. Because a customer doesn't buy his second favorite car. The 60s represented, for me anyway, a certain time of optimism. We were talking about going to the moon by the end of the decade. People were doing all these very creative things. There was a can-do spirit to the auto industry and to America at the time that was reflected in this car. Chrysler had done a lot of experimental work with turbine engines from the 50s in through the early 60s, and they got it to a point where they perfected it, so they wanted to find a place to showcase it. For 200 lucky families, they said, here's this vehicle, go drive it for a few months and tell us what you think. It's a very dramatic design, but it had kind of as its thesis this whole infatuation with jet propulsion and that kind of design language is evident in the vehicle. There's little fin details around the headlamps. It's like a little turbine. That character is actually in the center pad of the steering wheel. And you'll see that kind of a jet engine kind of display in the console where you have this tubular console. Very dramatic, very unique for its time, and I don't think there's anything that's ever been done like that since. There's a difference between cars that were done in the early 70s versus cars that were done in the late 70s. This is really Chrysler's answer to the muscle car. This body style came out in '69, and they called it the fuselage body style. And what was kind of unique about that is it was this very simplistic approach to car design. In a way, it looked like a spaceship, and the inspiration was really from aircraft, where everything was kind of this elliptical section and the windows were kind of set into the side of the vehicle. There was only 500 of these cars built. They made these parts out of fiberglass as opposed to making dies that they have to stamp. They made that a functioning hood scoop. It's not just a decorative piece, and it helped with the performance of the vehicle. It had a huge engine in it. It was a 440 TNT engine. It had a lot of horsepower. It was just a tremendous powerhouse of an engine at that time. Chrysler as a brand was known for building large cars. It was all about horsepower, it was all about performance, and it was all about kind of the visceral attitude of the vehicle. To me, this embodies all that.
'84 was when we first introduced the minivan, and at the time this vehicle was really a UFO. I mean, there was nothing else like it out there. It was really the first family people hauler, if you will, so that was really the significance of this car. It's very simple, very clean, very, very modern. Even the features like the wood grain on the side may not be in vogue as it was then, as it is today, but it's a pretty neat feature that basically set that vehicle apart and, you know, stood out in the marketplace for sure. At the time, it looked like ashtrays were more important maybe than cup holders, and so things have evolved over the years. There are some features though that have stayed. For instance, the armrests on the seats in this particular model, we still have those on today's minivans. One of the big features clearly is the sliding door. That's a feature that's unique to the minivan. That was really the first use of that. Chrysler has always been about innovation and about doing things that are new and different. When I see this vehicle, that's what I really think of as that innovation. The 90s was really kind of a coming out period of design, really, I think, for Chrysler. It started to become more about stance and proportion versus just, you know, styling on a package that, you know, we were carrying over from some previous decade. The 90s were more about let's do some new packages, some new proportions. And by the way, those proportions allow you to do these forms and shapes that are more expressive and that can be a little bit more of a personality and have more character to them. One of the key things with this car is the sculptural aspect of the vehicle. It's very beautiful line work, very flowing forms, very three-dimensional in nature. It's amazing, right? When you look at it, And it really starts with the proportions. It's a very long wheelbase, almost 200 inches in wheelbase, 21-inch wheels in the front, 22-inch wheels in the back. So especially for this time period, this car was breakthrough in terms of its heroic proportions. In the early 2000s, it was just the right time to come in with something that was new and different, you know, really stood out in the marketplace. It was also a return to our heritage, right? So we have a rich history of vehicles, and the Hemi engine was certainly a part of that in the 50s. And it was just a statement about performance, and about attitude, and just a return to, you know, having fun with vehicles. It brought back sort of a bold aesthetic to Chrysler. What was interesting about this car is that it didn't cause a stir just with a certain group of people. A certain customer demographic. It actually spanned many customer demographics. So people were attracted to this car whether they were 18 or whether they were 70. Starting with the front end, with the very vertical orientation of the front, a large central grille, very proud sort of American character, large headlamps as well, high belt, you know, gave you kind of more of a protective look. And, you know, again, just a little more of that attitude that just stood out from the crowd. Anything we design in the current day, we want to make sure it ends up in a museum like this and people can appreciate it for years to come.